Episode 61, March the 17th to the 18th, 1915. My last hours in the Irresistible. Marine's heroic story of the Dardanelles by L-Cpl Powell, Royal Marine. Read by Tom Ashworth. All through the day of March the 17th, 1915, the Irresistible had been in a seething state of excitement. On deck in the various casemates, the guns crews had been busily engaged in seeing to their beloved guns. One man testing the sights, the ammunition numbers getting their supply of shells ready. Every man was doing his little bit with a quiet smile of satisfaction, and similar scenes were being enacted through the great fleet that lay riding at anchorage. Such a fleet as had never before assembled in such a place. A magnificent spectacle it was, to see the different warships, all manner and classes of them, from the gigantic super-dreadnought Queen Elizabeth, known throughout the fleet as the Lizzie, down to the humble trawlers, the little boats that did their work equally as well as the biggest ship there. Grim black destroyers raced to and from the flagship, where the admiral was holding a council with all the captains of the fleet. The French admiral, his officers, and a representative of one Russian warship, all were there, and such a meeting it was too. A meeting that on the morrow was to produce results that would be talked about half the world over. For the 18th was the day selected for the grand assault on the Dardanelles forts. The shrill whistles of the boatswain's mates woke us in the morning. Show a leg, rise and shine. At last the day, so long looked forward to, had arrived. The day for which all the preparations had been made. Down below in the stokehold and engine room, the grimy stokers were getting up steam, half naked, black with coal dust, the men who were seen least of all, and yet no body of men work harder. Down below again, behind the armoured belt, the surgeons and their assistants were busy erecting a miniature hospital. Several operating tables were to be seen, lint and bandages were laid out, the instruments all handy, ready for any emergency. In the various parts of the ship, the bluejackets and marines were going about their work, some testing the watertight doors on which so much depended, others closing all deadlights, screwing down the steel covers to keep out any stray missiles. Soon the whole ship was still. At last we were cleared for action, and truly grim did we look. A vast mass of 15,000 tons, a floating fortress indeed. On deck, groups of men clustered together, talking eagerly amongst themselves, and over all hung a curious air of expectancy, a feeling hard to define. At 8 a.m. the big ships were to commence their task. Sure enough, on the stroke of 8 bells we could see the giant Queen Elizabeth slowly steaming away, followed by the Lord Nelson, Inflexible, and Agamemnon. Truly a sight to stir one's blood. Those monster ships with ever-increasing speed, heading towards the Dardanelles and their grim work of destruction. Followed the French squadron, 4 ships of the line, so different in build to our own ships, yet giving one a true impression of their power, ugly, squat ships, yet so very grim and businesslike. In one long line they steamed away, and now there remained only the older battleships, the old crocs as we call them. There was the Irresistible, of course in the writer's opinion the best ship of the lot, the Albion, Ocean, Triumph, Switchure, and Majestic, not one of them under 15 years of age, and yet for this particular kind of work not to be equalled. A very short while elapsed before the ships that had left us got to work. The thunder of their guns could be heard quite plainly by us. I'm sure there wasn't a man amongst us who did not envy our comrades already up there, although we all knew that our turn would not be very long in coming. The morning dragged along slowly. No incident worth recording occurred, unless it was a signal flashed back to our waiting squadron from the Queen Elizabeth saying that splendid progress was being made. But all things come to an end, and our turn of inactivity was almost over. Shortly before noon, the signal came through for our little fleet to proceed, the signal we'd all been waiting for so patiently. At last we were to have our turn. "Hands to anchor stations," was piped, and in less time almost than it takes to tell, we were under way, steaming slowly ahead, waiting to take our place in line. Forming up into line ahead, the Albion leading, our squadron steamed slowly towards the entrance of the Dardanelles. As yet all hands were on deck, eager to have one last look around before we went to action stations. As we turned the corner and caught our first sight of the ships already there, we instantly realised what we were in for. A long way up the straits, spread about all over the place, were the Allied ships, the French lying right in close to both shores, while lying behind and firing over them were our own 4 big ships. All around the water was dotted with white splashes of foam, where the Turkish shells were falling. What with the vivid flashes from the guns, the splashes from the shells now falling ahead, now astern, it was truly a sight never to be forgotten. But any more looking on was cut short by the bugle sounding, "Action!" At the rush, everybody went to their respective stations, and then, with the guns loaded and everything ready to begin, the 6 crocks steamed into position, into the inferno of shells and shot. What my feelings were, I'll leave the reader to guess. Secure inside an upper-deck casemate, and looking through the aperture through which our gun poked, I had an excellent view of it all. I could see the shells dropping all around us, hear them whistling and shrieking overhead, and as yet we had not fired a round. But soon we commenced, and in a very short time all the 14 battleships were hammering away for all they were worth. The noise was tremendous, one continual roar. Surely, I thought, nothing ashore could live under such a tremendous fire. For nearly 6 hours now the bombardment had been going on, and yet there had been no lull in the firing. If anything, it increased in its intensity as the afternoon wore on. Some part of the time, our gun would not bear on the target, so our gun's crew had an opportunity of looking out a little to see what was going on all around. From where I was, I could see, almost at the very entrance to the straits, it seemed, the Queen Elizabeth battering away, her huge 15-inch guns pointing upwards, and great clouds of yellow smoke drifting away from her every time she fired. And all around her the water was splashed up in tremendous columns. Shells were being simply poured in her direction. Yet through it all the Lizzie continued her firing, in contempt, as it were, of these puny efforts to do her harm. It seemed marvellous to us, looking on, that she was not hit. Time was getting on. Still there was no lull in the firing. Looking out of my casement, I could observe one of the French squadron. We afterwards knew it to have been the Bouvet. As she came along, all her guns blazing away, she presented a remarkable picture. Little did the poor fellows aboard her realize how very near they were to their doom. It all happened so suddenly. One minute the Bouvet was steaming majestically along. The next moment a tremendous cloud of smoke or steam arose, completely hiding her from view, and when, after 2 or 3 minutes, the smoke cleared away, where there had been a gallant ship, there now remained only a few struggling forms in the water. Up dashed a destroyer, which soon had the poor fellows aboard, and all the while the shells were falling fast around the little vessel, as if to drive her from her errand of mercy. Yet she was not touched, and turning, sped away at full speed for the entrance of the straits. To celebrate, as it were, the success on the enemy's part, the firing from land became fiercer than ever. It was about this time that the Irresistible received her first blow. A shell, I think it must have been a 14-inch, hit us somewhere forward. Fair and square it caught us, for the whole ship shook, actually reeled over a little, and then righted itself once more to an even keel. A few minutes after this first hit, another big shell burst in the water immediately outside our casement, simply drenching everyone inside with the splash it made. Water was everywhere. A column of it was raised high enough to swamp a smaller vessel. Things began to be rather lively now. It seemed to us that the Irresistible was being made the sole target, judging by the number of shells that fell around us, although of course such was not the case. One of the chaps in our room remarked with a grin, "Something will happen in a minute. It is getting hot." And sure enough, something did happen. We had just been hit again, forward, by another big shell that shook us all up, and then, before we had time to recover ourselves, a tremendous shock was felt. Fully half a dozen of our crew were thrown violently over, and when order had been regained, there was the old Irresistible heeling over to port at an angle of fully 45 degrees, and our gun pointing in the air for all the world like an anti-aircraft gun. It did not need anyone to explain. We one and all knew that the Irresistible had fought her last fight. My feelings at this moment were too awful to describe. I never want to feel the same as I did then. Little did I think, while watching the Bouvet go down, that our own turn was so soon to come. Except for the men who had been thrown down picking themselves up, nobody had moved in our casemate. All we could do was to await orders, looking, meanwhile, into each other's white, set faces. But we were not to remain long waiting. Orders came along to clear the casemate, everybody to get on deck. So, opening the casemate doors, we trooped out, wondering what would be the next thing to happen. Then we were told to get aft, so aft we all went, and in a very short while all the ship's company, with the exception of the gun crew who were still firing, fell in their places. Not a sign of panic or disorder showed itself anywhere. Everybody had gone to his respective station just as calmly as if it were a parade. Now that we were aft, in the open, we could get a clear view of what was going on around us. Our ship had almost righted itself, although we could see how low in the water she was. Eagerly we gazed around to see, as we hoped, a welcome destroyer or torpedo boat coming towards us. But no one was near us. At least so it seemed. Suddenly a man standing right aft pointed to the entrance of the straits, and we could see far away a destroyer or boat or some sort speeding towards us, smoke flying from her funnels. A welcome sight indeed. But now came the worst part of our troubles. Even as I recall it, the thought of it causes me to shudder. Since the Irresistible had received her death blow, we had, almost unnoticed to us, been quietly drifting towards the Asiatic side of the straits. The Turks ashore must have quickly realised how helpless we were, for instantly scores and scores of guns were trained upon us, and the shells began to drop all around. Truly a most uncomfortable position for us, over 600 men helpless, forced to stand and endure this. And all the while the destroyer was getting ever nearer to us, and just as surely the Turks and the shore batteries were finding our range. Soon the shells began to fall closer and closer, raising tremendous columns of water where they struck, some bursting and turning the water black for yards around. If ever men lived through moments of agony, we did then. These awful shells, ever growing nearer, struck terror into our hearts. He would be an extraordinary man who would have taken no notice of them. But the hour of our deliverance was almost at hand. Nearer and nearer came the destroyer, the Weir, commanded by Captain Metcalfe, and finally, while hardly decreasing her speed, she came up alongside, her propellers churning the water as she went full speed astern. And in almost less time than it takes to tell, she was secure, made fast head and stern, motionless, as fine a piece of seamanship as man ever witnessed. Our captain, who all this time had never left the bridge despite the now constant hail of shells, gave the order, "Boys and ordinary seamen, in the boat." One can imagine with what speed this order was obeyed, but through it all there was not the slightest rush of any sort. Every boy and man took his place, passing from the doomed ship to the destroyer as if he were going ashore on leave. Followed the order, "All hands next." Our turn at last. From a dozen different places we streamed over the side into the destroyer and safety. But not all of us were destined to be saved. At the very moment when the last batch of men were preparing to leave the quarterdeck, a shell burst amongst them. What followed, seen by practically all the ship's company, would be too horrible to describe. But when the smoke had cleared the way, on the spot where before had stood a dozen men, nothing now remained but a few mangled forms. Men already in the destroyer, forced to witness such a sight, were splashed from head to foot with the blood of their comrades. Volunteers quickly scrambled aboard the ship again and carried those poor fellows in whom there still existed a spark of life aboard the destroyer. At last all who were going to leave were aboard, and the destroyer was cast off by a few brave fellows who had volunteered to stay for this purpose. With her precious freight of over 600 souls, she slipped away from the stricken ship, and gradually gaining speed turned round and was off towards the entrance and safety. And not a moment too soon, for even as the destroyer left the Irresistible, a salvo of shells, 6 or 8 of them, fell into the water, exactly on the spot where a moment before we had been. Truly a narrower escape it would have been impossible to have had, for had the destroyer been there at that particular moment, nothing would have saved us all from destruction. For those shells would have crushed the destroyer like an eggshell. So there we were now, speeding along at a tremendous rate. One last look we had at the poor old Irresistible. There she lay, the water now almost level with her quarterdeck, the shells, now that the batteries had found the range, bursting all over her, and on the bridge, standing there so calmly, gazing after the fast disappearing destroyer, Captain Dent, who with 10 volunteers remained, the whole presenting such a scene as few men who saw it will ever forget. There were, I should say, very few dry eyes amongst us as we gazed upon that scene, for the old Irresistible had been a good ship, none better, so she passed from our view. Never more would we see her again, the ship that had been our home for so many months. Very soon we were all aboard the Queen Elizabeth, the wounded carried below while the destroyer raced off again on a second errand of mercy. We heard later on that Captain Dent and those left aboard the Irresistible had been saved. What a cheer we gave when we heard the glad news.
Brother Bertie went away.